You think you know Cleopatra, the seductress who brought Rome to its knees with nothing but her beauty and bedroom skills. The woman who bathed in milk, draped herself in silk so sheer it was practically invisible, and invented vibrators powered by angry bees. The queen who supposedly slept with 100 men in one night and still left unsatisfied. Here's what they don't tell you. Almost everything you believe about Cleopatra's sex life is a lie. And the truth is so much more disturbing than fiction, because this isn't a story about a hypersexual nymphomaniac. This is a story about the most successful character assassination in human history, a propaganda campaign so effective that it's still working 2,000 years later. And when you peel back the lies, what you find underneath will change everything you thought you knew about power, sexuality, and the lengths men will go to destroy a woman who refused to submit. If this sounds like the kind of dark history they don't teach in school, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to expose secrets that have been buried for over 2,000 years. And trust me, you're going to want to see where this goes. Picture Rome in 31 BCE. The most powerful empire on earth is about to go to war, not against barbarians or foreign kings, but against one woman. Her name is Cleopatra VII Philopator, Queen of Egypt, and she has committed the ultimate crime in Roman eyes. She has made their men want her. 2 of their greatest generals have fallen under her spell: Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul; Marcus Antonius, known to us as Mark Antony, the warrior who avenged Caesar's murder. Both of them abandoned Rome, abandoned duty, abandoned their wives for her. And Rome cannot forgive that. So they do what Romans do best. They don't just defeat her, they annihilate her reputation. They turn her into a monster, a whore, a creature of insatiable sexual appetite who uses her body as a weapon. And they do it so thoroughly, so systematically, that the lie becomes immortal. The poet Sextus Propertius calls her the whore queen of debauched Canopus. Canopus was a city Romans associated with every sexual perversion imaginable. By linking Cleopatra to it, Propertius is painting her as the embodiment of Eastern depravity. Another poet, Lucan, describes her at a banquet wearing see-through fabric, her breasts visible through Sidonian silk, dripping with pearls from the Red Sea, painted like a prostitute. These aren't objective descriptions. These are character assassinations dressed up as poetry. But here's what makes this propaganda so insidious. It worked. For 2,000 years, it has worked. We still repeat these lies as if they were facts. We still imagine Cleopatra as the ultimate femme fatale, using sex to manipulate men. And we completely miss what actually happened. Because when you look at the historical record, when you strip away the Roman spin, you find something shocking. Cleopatra is only confirmed to have had sex with 2 men in her entire life. 2, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. That's it. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman history remembers as the most promiscuous ruler who ever lived had exactly 2 sexual partners that we can actually verify. In an era when Roman emperors were openly sleeping with dozens of mistresses, when Roman men regularly visited brothels and kept concubines, Cleopatra had 2 relationships. Both were long-term, both were strategic, both produced children. This isn't the behavior of a nymphomaniac. This is the behavior of a calculating political operator who understood exactly what she was doing. So where did all the other stories come from? The orgies? The 100 men in one night, the bees? Let me tell you about the mechanics of historical character assassination. And trust me, it gets worse. The story about Cleopatra sleeping with 100 men in a single night, that comes from a forged letter, not a letter written by an enemy during her lifetime, not even a letter written a few decades after her death. This letter was forged by a Swiss antiquarian named Melchior Goldast, over 1,600 years after Cleopatra died. 1,600 years. Goldast claimed the letter was from Mark Antony to a medical writer, describing how Cleopatra disguised herself, went to a brothel, and had sex with 106 men in one night, leaving still unsatisfied. But here's the thing. Goldust didn't even bother to make up an original story. He just copied an existing Roman tale about Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, changed the name to Cleopatra, and presented it as authentic. And people believed him. Classicists believed him. For centuries, this obvious forgery was treated as genuine historical evidence. The bee-powered vibrator, that one's even more recent. It first appears in a 1992 book called The Encyclopedia of Unusual Sex Practices. The author cites no sources. It appears in no ancient text. It exists in no archaeological record. Someone just made it up, and it spread across the internet like wildfire because it was shocking and sexual and involved one of history's most famous women. Modern scholars have traced every reference back to that single 1992 book. Before that, nothing. It's a complete fabrication. And yet you can find it repeated as fact on BBC programs, on educational websites, in YouTube videos, with millions of views. The story about Cleopatra offering to sleep with anyone who agreed to be executed the next morning. That one comes from an anonymous text written 300 years after her death, then popularized by a French novelist in 1838. Théophile Gautier wrote a fictional short story where a young man spies on Cleopatra bathing, gets caught, and she offers him one night of pleasure before he has to drink poison at dawn. It's complete fiction. Gautier made it up. But in 2017, the video game Assassin's Creed Origins included a scene where Cleopatra makes this exact proclamation at a party. Millions of players saw it. Many probably assumed it was historically accurate. It's not. It never was. Do you see the pattern? Every scandalous story about Cleopatra's sex life is either ancient propaganda, medieval fiction, or modern fabrication. Every single one. There is not one credible historical source that describes her as sexually promiscuous. Not one. And yet the image persists. Why? Because destroying Cleopatra sexually was the only way Rome could defeat her completely. Think about what she actually accomplished. She was the last Pharaoh of Egypt, ruling one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world. She spoke 9 languages. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who bothered to learn Egyptian. She negotiated directly with Rome as an equal, something almost no other monarch could do. She commanded armies. She controlled Egypt's grain supply, which fed the entire Mediterranean. She was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely terrifying to Roman men because she refused to play by their rules. So they did what threatened men have done throughout history. They made it about sex. They couldn't deny her intelligence, so they claimed she used seduction. They couldn't deny her power, so they said she gained it through manipulation. They turned her into a sexual object because that was the only framework that made sense to them. A woman couldn't possibly be powerful through skill and strategy. She must be using her body. The Roman poet Cassius Dio, writing 200 years after Cleopatra's death, claimed she was a woman of insatiable sexuality and insatiable avarice. Another writer said she was worn out by her own attendants, implying she was so sexually voracious even her servants couldn't satisfy her. The poet Juvenal claimed she visited brothels at night in disguise. None of these men knew her. None of them were contemporary sources. They were repeating propaganda, building on lies, creating a mythology designed to justify Rome's destruction of Egypt. And here's what makes it truly evil. It worked so well that we still believe it. We've internalized Roman propaganda so deeply that we can't even see Cleopatra clearly anymore. When we think of her, we don't think of the polyglot queen who negotiated trade agreements and commanded naval fleets. We think of Elizabeth Taylor in a gold dress, reclining seductively on a couch. We think of sex, not strategy, seduction, not scholarship, the male gaze, not the female mind. Let me tell you what Cleopatra actually did with sex. She had a strategic relationship with Julius Caesar that secured her throne. When she was 21 years old, she was in a civil war with her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar arrived in Egypt, pursuing his rival Pompey. Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, probably rolled up in a carpet or bedding. This is real. Ancient sources confirm it. And yes, she seduced him. But seduce doesn't mean what you think it means. Cleopatra spoke to Caesar in his own language, something few other monarchs could do. She understood Roman politics. She offered him something he desperately needed: legitimacy in Egypt and access to Egyptian wealth. In return, he helped her win the civil war against her brother. They became lovers. She got pregnant. She gave birth to a son, Caesarion. And here's what you need to understand. This wasn't some passionate love affair. This was a political alliance sealed with sex, because that's how power worked in the ancient world. Caesar was married. Cleopatra was married to her brother. Both marriages were political. Both continued during the affair. Nobody pretended otherwise. When Cleopatra went to Rome to be with Caesar, she brought her brother husband Ptolemy XIV with her. It was all completely open. Romans didn't care about sexual fidelity the way modern Christians do. They cared about power and legitimacy. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She left immediately, went back to Egypt, and within a short time, her brother husband was dead. Did she have him killed? Probably. He was 12 years old and served no purpose anymore. She made her son Caesarion co-ruler instead. This is the woman Rome was dealing with, not a seductress, a survivor. Then came Mark Antony. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him in 41 BCE. Rome had split into a second triumvirate, and Antony controlled the eastern provinces. He needed Egyptian money to fund his military campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection. They met in Tarsus, and according to the ancient historian Plutarch, Cleopatra arrived on a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. She dressed as the goddess Venus. It was theatre, calculated, brilliant theatre designed to awe Antony and establish her as his equal, not his subject. It worked. They became lovers. But here's what's interesting. They didn't just jump into bed immediately. They formed a political alliance first. Antony spent the winter in Alexandria, and they created something called the Society of Inimitable Livers. This is where the orgy stories come from. But what was it really? It was a symposium, a drinking club, a social society. Yes, there was feasting and drinking and entertainment. That's what symposiums were. But the idea that it was some kind of endless sex party comes from Roman sources trying to paint Antony as corrupted by Eastern decadence. Cleopatra got pregnant with twins. Antony went back to Rome and married Octavia, the sister of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. He stayed in Rome for 4 years. 4 years. If Cleopatra was this irresistible sexual magnet, why did Antony spend 4 years in a political marriage in Rome? Because the relationship was always about politics first, sex second. When Antony finally returned to Egypt, it was because he needed Cleopatra's money for his war against Parthia. They had another child together. They got married, even though Antony was still technically married to Octavia. This was the final insult Rome couldn't forgive. Not that he was sleeping with Cleopatra. Romans didn't care about that. But that he married her, that he gave her legitimacy, that he treated an Eastern queen as equal to a Roman. Octavian, Antony's rival for control of Rome, seized on this. He launched a propaganda campaign that would echo for 2,000 years. He portrayed Antony as a man destroyed by lust, enslaved by an Eastern whore who had turned him against Rome. He portrayed Cleopatra as a witch, a seductress, a threat to Roman civilization itself. The Senate declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. They made her the enemy, because if she was the villain, Antony could be portrayed as her victim. They met at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra and Antony's forces were defeated. They fled back to Egypt. Octavian followed. When his army reached Alexandria, it was over. Antony received false news that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. He didn't die immediately. He was carried to Cleopatra, and he died in her arms. That part, at least, might have been genuine feeling, but we'll never know for sure. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian, and here's where it gets truly fascinating. According to Roman sources, she tried to seduce him. She dressed in mourning clothes that somehow wonderfully became her. She arranged herself artfully on a couch, surrounded by images of Julius Caesar, his letters tucked into her bosom. She spoke in melting tones and cast sweet glances at Octavian, trying to work the same magic that had supposedly enslaved Caesar and Antony. It didn't work. Octavian was immune. He wanted to parade her through Rome in chains as part of his triumph. For Cleopatra, this was a fate worse than death. She had been Pharaoh of Egypt, Queen of Kings. She would not be humiliated as a captive in a Roman parade. So she killed herself. The famous snake, the asp, is probably a myth. She likely used poison. She died on August 12th, 30 BCE. She was 39 years old, and that's when the real destruction began. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He systematically erased Cleopatra from history. Her images were destroyed. Her temples were defaced. Her name became synonymous with Eastern corruption. And Roman writers, eager to please the emperor, began crafting the narrative we still believe today. The seductress, the whore, the woman whose sexuality destroyed two great men. But here's what they couldn't erase: the facts. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for 22 years. She maintained Egyptian independence in an era when Rome was conquering the entire Mediterranean. She secured food security for her people through multiple famines. She built alliances, commanded fleets, negotiated treaties, and stayed in power longer than almost any of her predecessors. She did all of this while giving birth to 4 children, managing a hostile sibling, and navigating the collapse of the Roman Republic. And she did it with exactly 2 sexual relationships, both of which were strategic, long-term, and politically advantageous. That's not the behavior of a sex-addicted nymphomaniac. That's the behavior of one of the most skilled political operators in ancient history. And Rome couldn't allow that narrative to survive. So they made it about sex. They always make it about sex when they want to destroy a powerful woman. They did it to Cleopatra. They did it to Messalina. They did it to Theodora. They did it to Catherine the Great. They do it to female politicians today. The playbook never changes. If you can't defeat her arguments, attack her sexuality. If you can't match her intelligence, call her a seductress. If you can't beat her, turn her into a whore. And it works. God help us. It works. Because 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Cleopatra's sex life instead of her political genius. We're still asking if she really had a vibrator made of bees instead of asking how she maintained Egyptian sovereignty against Rome for over 2 decades. We're still portraying her in gold bikinis and smoky eye makeup instead of showing her reading diplomatic correspondence in 9 different languages. The historical sources we have about Cleopatra are almost all written by her enemies. Romans who wanted her dead, writers who benefited from her destruction, poets currying favor with Augustus. We're seeing her through the eyes of men who considered her the ultimate enemy. And yet, even through that distorted lens, even through 2,000 years of propaganda and fabrication and misogyny, the truth leaks through. She was brilliant. She was strategic. She was ruthless when she needed to be. She used every tool available to her, including her sexuality. But sexuality was never the primary tool. It was just one weapon in an extensive arsenal. Think about what it took to survive as Cleopatra. She came to power at 18 through a will that made her co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother. Egyptian law required her to have a male co-ruler. She couldn't rule alone, so she married her brother. He was a child. She was an adult. The marriage was fiction, but within 3 years, his advisors had forced her into exile. She had to flee Egypt, had to raise an army, had to seduce Julius Caesar to get military support to reclaim her throne. Her brother drowned during the Civil War. Convenient. Then she married her other brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was maybe 11 years old. Another fiction, another placeholder. He died mysteriously after Caesar's assassination. Also convenient. She made her 3-year-old son Caesarion her co-ruler instead. A 3-year-old couldn't threaten her power. This is someone who understood the game at a level most people can't imagine. She navigated Roman politics, Egyptian religion, palace intrigue, and military conflicts simultaneously. She had to keep the Egyptian priesthood happy, keep Rome from invading, keep her own family from murdering her, and keep her kingdom fed, all while maintaining the fiction that she shared power with males, because that's what the law required. And she did it. For 22 years she did it. The propaganda machine wants you to believe she did it with sex. The truth is she did it with intelligence, ruthlessness, political skill, and yes, strategic use of sexuality when it served her purposes. She wasn't a victim of her desires. She was a master of manipulation. And that, ultimately, is what Rome couldn't forgive. The tragedy is that we've let Rome win. We've internalized their propaganda so completely that we can't see past it. When you Google Cleopatra, you get images of seduction. When you watch movies about her, they focus on her relationships with men. When historians discuss her, they spend more time on her sex life than her administrative achievements. We have reduced one of the most formidable rulers in ancient history to a collection of bedroom stories, most of which are literally fake. And that's the real scandal of Cleopatra's sex life. Not what she did, but what we've done to her memory. We've participated in her character assassination. We've spread Roman propaganda as if it were truth. We've turned a polyglot queen who ruled one of the richest kingdoms on earth into a sexy Halloween costume. We've made her into an object of male fantasy instead of recognizing her as a subject of historical importance in her own right. The bees never existed. The orgies never happened. The 100 men in one night is a recycled lie from a different woman's propaganda. The execution offer is fiction from a French novelist. Everything scandalous you've heard is either Roman propaganda, medieval invention, or modern fabrication. What's left when you strip that all away? A woman who had 2 strategic sexual relationships over 22 years of rule. A woman who spoke 9 languages, negotiated with Rome as an equal, and maintained her kingdom's independence longer than anyone thought possible. A woman who was so threatening to the most powerful empire on earth that they had to destroy her reputation for 2,000 years just to make sure she stayed dead. That's the real story of Cleopatra's sex life. Not what she did in bed, but what they did to her memory. Not her sexuality, but their fear of it. Not her actions, but their reaction. And if that doesn't tell you something about how power works, about how history is written, about how we still use sexuality to destroy women who refuse to submit, then you haven't been paying attention. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, but the war against her is still being fought. Every time someone repeats the B story, Rome wins. Every time someone calls her a seductress instead of a strategist, Augustus smiles in his grave. Every time we focus on who she slept with instead of what she accomplished, we're participating in the longest-running character assassination in human history. The question isn't whether Cleopatra was sexual. The question is why we're still so obsessed with her sexuality 2,000 years later, when we barely mention the sexual exploits of her male contemporaries. Why do we know every rumor about Cleopatra's bedroom, but can barely name 3 things she actually accomplished? That's not history, that's propaganda, and it's still working.